Billionaire's son kicks out black waitress, not knowing she owns the restaurant. What if everything you thought you knew about power and respect could change in a single moment? Margaret Williams adjusted her name tag one more time as she walked through the elegant dining room of Magnolia's, the restaurant she'd built from nothing over 30 years ago. The crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light just the way she'd always dreamed they would when she was a young girl, washing dishes in her grandmother's tiny kitchen. But today, she wasn't here as the owner, she was working alongside her staff, something she did every few months to stay connected to the heart of her business. The lunch rush was winding down when the front doors swung open with more force than necessary. A young man in an expensive suit strode in, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant like he owned the place. Margaret smoothed her apron and stepped forward with the same warm smile she'd given thousands of customers over the years. "Where are you watching this story from today?" Margaret had opened Magnolia's in 1994 with a loan she'd fought tooth and nail to get, working 3 jobs to make the down payment. Back then, this neighborhood was rough around the edges, but she'd seen its potential. She'd named the restaurant after her grandmother's favorite flower, and every recipe on the menu came from handwritten cards passed down through 3 generations of strong women who'd made miracles happen in their kitchens with whatever they had. The young man who'd just entered was clearly not from the neighborhood. His suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the way he gestured while talking on his phone suggested he was used to getting his way. Margaret recognized the type. She'd served plenty of wealthy customers over the years, most of them kind and respectful. This one felt different. "I don't care what the board says, Dad," he was saying into his phone, his voice sharp with irritation. "I'll handle the acquisition my way. These people don't understand business like we do." He snapped his fingers at Margaret without even looking at her. "Table for 1. Somewhere quiet. I've got important calls to make." Margaret's smile never wavered, though something cold settled in her stomach. "Of course, sir. Right this way." She led him to a corner booth, the same one where she'd celebrated her daughter's acceptance to medical school just last month. "Can I start you with something to drink?" He barely glanced up from his phone. "Whatever. Coffee. Black. And make it fast, I don't have all day." His name, Margaret learned from overhearing his conversation, was Bradley Ashworth III. The Ashworth name was familiar. They owned half the commercial real estate in the city, including several buildings just a few blocks away. As Margaret poured his coffee, she couldn't help but notice how he treated the other staff. When young Denise, who was working her way through college, politely asked if he was ready to order, he waved her away dismissively. When Carlos, their busboy, accidentally bumped the table while clearing nearby dishes, Bradley's head snapped up with a look that could freeze fire. "Watch where you're going," Bradley snapped. "Do you have any idea what this suit costs? More than you'll make in 6 months, I guarantee it." Carlos apologized quietly, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Margaret felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her professional composure. She'd built her reputation on treating every customer with dignity, even the difficult ones. Her grandmother had always said you could judge a person's character by how they treated people who couldn't fight back. Bradley's phone rang again, and his conversation grew louder and more agitated. Margaret began to understand that the Ashworth family was in the middle of acquiring several local businesses, and from what she could gather, they weren't particularly concerned about what happened to the employees or the community impact. "Dad, these places are gold mines waiting to happen," Bradley said, his voice carrying across the now quiet restaurant. "We tear down these old buildings, put up something modern, and triple our investment. Who cares about some mom-and-pop shops that can't compete anyway?" Margaret's blood ran cold as she realized what he was describing sounded exactly like the block where Magnolia's sat. She'd heard rumors about developers circling the neighborhood, but she'd assumed her lease was secure. As she refilled his coffee cup with steady hands, she wondered if this young man had any idea that he might be sitting in one of the very establishments he was so casually planning to destroy. The lunch crowd had thinned to just a few tables when Bradley's conversation took an even more troubling turn. Margaret was wiping down the counter, keeping one ear on his increasingly animated phone call, when she heard something that made her heart skip. "The Magnolia Block project?" "Yeah, Dad's been working on that for months, Bradley said, leaning back in his booth with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real opposition. There's this little restaurant there, Magnolia's or something. The owner's been stubborn about selling, but we'll get them out eventually. These people always cave when they realize they can't fight progress. Margaret's hand stilled on the counter. Her restaurant. He was talking about her restaurant, her life's work, while sitting in it and treating her staff like servants. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so infuriating. She watched as Bradley gestured dismissively while talking about the neighborhood families who'd built their lives around these blocks. Look, sentimental value doesn't pay the bills, he continued. These old-timers need to understand that change is inevitable. We're doing them a favor, really. Most of these places are probably struggling anyway. Denise approached Margaret with concern written across her young face. Ms. Williams, she whispered. Is he talking about us? About Magnolias. Margaret placed a gentle hand on Denise's shoulder. This girl had been working here for 2 years, saving every penny for her education. Carlos had been with Margaret for 8 years, sending money home to his family in El Salvador. Her entire staff wasn't just employees, they were family. The thought of this entitled young man casually discussing their destruction while they served him made her grandmother's voice echo in her mind. Sometimes, baby girl, you got to stand up even when your knees are shaking. Bradley's phone conversation grew even more heated as what appeared to be his father challenged him on something. No, I can handle this myself, he insisted. I don't need the lawyers yet. Sometimes you just have to show these people who's in charge. That's when things took a turn for the worse. Denise, nervous from overhearing the conversation about the restaurant's future, accidentally spilled a small amount of water while refilling Bradley's glass. It was barely a few drops, but Bradley exploded. Are you kidding me? He shouted, jumping up from his seat. Look what you've done. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Incompetent people who have no business working in a real establishment. His voice carried through the restaurant, causing the few remaining customers to turn and stare. Denise's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry, sir. Let me get you a towel. Don't touch anything else, Bradley snapped. Where's your manager? I want someone competent to deal with this mess. He looked around the restaurant with disgust. Actually, you know what? I'm done here. This place is exactly the kind of establishment that gives this neighborhood a bad reputation. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar feeling from the early days when she'd had to fight for every loan, every permit, every ounce of respect. She walked slowly toward Bradley's table, her grandmother's strength flowing through her veins. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. Sir, she said quietly, I think there might be some confusion here. Bradley turned to Margaret with the full force of his privilege and entitlement. Confusion? The only confusion here is how a place like this stays in business with such incompetent staff. He pulled out his phone again, as if he was about to call someone important. Do you have any idea who I am? Who my family is? Margaret looked at this young man, really looked at him, and saw something that broke her heart even through her anger. Beneath all the bluster and entitlement, she recognized something she'd seen before. The look of someone who'd never had to prove their worth, never had to fight for anything, never learned that true respect comes from how you treat others when you think no one important is watching. My family owns half this city, Bradley continued, his voice rising. We're in the process of acquiring this entire block, and when we do, places like this will be nothing but a memory. You're all going to be out of jobs anyway, so maybe this is just a preview of your future. The cruelty in his words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but what hurt more was watching the faces of her staff. Carlos had stepped protectively closer to Denise, who was still fighting back tears. Old Mr. Peterson, who'd been coming in for coffee and pie every Tuesday for 15 years, looked shocked by the young man's outburst. These were good people, hard-working people who deserved better than to be dismissed as obstacles to profit. Margaret thought about her journey to this moment. She remembered being 25 years old, standing in a bank office while a loan officer looked at her business plan and laughed. Restaurants fail, especially in that neighborhood, he'd said. Especially when they're run by. He hadn't finished the sentence, but she'd heard the unspoken words loud and clear. She remembered the nights she'd stayed up until 3 in the morning, learning bookkeeping and inventory management, teaching herself everything she needed to know to make her dream work. She remembered her grandmother's hands, weathered from decades of cooking and cleaning for other families, gently teaching her that food made with love could heal hearts and build communities. "You don't understand," Bradley was saying now, his phone back to his ear. "Dad, I'm telling you, we need to accelerate the timeline on the Magnolia project. I'm sitting in this place right now, and it's exactly what we thought, outdated, unprofessional, probably barely scraping by. The owner will take whatever we offer when they realize they don't have a choice." Margaret's heart pounded as she realized this moment was bigger than just one rude customer. This was about the future of everything she'd built, everyone she employed, every family that depended on magnolias for their livelihood. This was about whether wealth and power could simply bulldoze over the dreams and lives of working people without consequence. She looked around her restaurant, at the framed photos of family recipes, at the community bulletin board where neighbors posted job openings and babysitting offers, at the corner where the local book club met every Thursday evening. This wasn't just a business, it was a heart of the community. Bradley hung up his phone and fixed Margaret with a cold stare. "Look, I don't have time for this amateur hour. I want to speak to whoever's actually in charge here, not the help. Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments." Margaret took a deep breath, feeling 30 years of strength, struggle, and success flowing through her. "Sir," she said quietly, "I think it's time you knew exactly who you're talking to." Margaret walked to the hostess stand and pulled out a leather folder that she kept there for special occasions. Inside were the original deed to the building, her business license, and a framed copy of the first review Magnolias had ever received. 4 stars from the city's most respected food critic, who had written, "In a world of corporate chains, Magnolias proves that authentic hospitality and genuine care for community still exist." "Mr. Ashworth," she said, returning to where Bradley stood with his phone still in hand, looking impatient and superior. "I believe you were asking to speak to whoever's in charge." She handed him her business license, watching as his eyes scanned the document. The color slowly drained from his face as he read, "Margaret Elise Williams, owner and proprietor, Magnolia's Restaurant, established 1994. "That's not possible," he whispered, looking from the document to Margaret's face and back again. You were serving coffee." "I was serving coffee in my own restaurant," Margaret said gently. "To a customer who was discussing plans to destroy my life's work while treating my staff, my family, with complete disrespect." She took the license back and looked directly into his eyes. "Mr. Ashworth, I've been the owner of this establishment for 30 years. I built it from nothing, and I've never once had to kick out a customer. But there's a first time for everything." Bradley's phone slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor. The restaurant had gone completely silent except for the soft jazz playing from the speakers Margaret had installed herself when she first opened. I didn't know. I mean, how was I supposed to? How were you supposed to know that the black woman serving your coffee might actually be successful? Might actually own something valuable?" Margaret's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "How were you supposed to know that treating people with basic human dignity is the right thing to do regardless of who they are or what they own?" The young man stood there, looking for the first time in his life like someone who'd run out of words, out of explanations, out of the privilege that had always protected him from the consequences of his actions. Margaret looked around at her restaurant, at Carlos who stood ready to support her, at Denise whose tears had dried and been replaced by something that looked like pride, at Mr. Peterson who was quietly applauding from his corner booth. "Mr. Ashworth," she continued, "your family has been trying to buy this building for months. My answer has been no, and it will continue to be no. Not because I don't understand business, but because I understand something your father apparently never taught you, that some things are worth more than money." She walked to the front door and held it open. "I think it's time for you to leave." "And Mr. Ashworth? When you talked to your father about the Magnolia project, You tell him that Margaret Williams said this community isn't for sale. Bradley bent to pick up his phone, his hands shaking slightly. As he walked toward the door, he stopped and turned back. Mrs. Williams, I'm sorry. I really didn't know. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Margaret nodded once. Now you do. As the door closed behind Bradley Ashworth III, Margaret felt the weight of 30 years settle on her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a crown. The restaurant remained quiet for a moment, and then something beautiful happened. Mr. Peterson started clapping again, slowly and deliberately. Denise joined in, then Carlos, and soon the handful of customers who had witnessed the entire exchange were giving Margaret a standing ovation. Ms. Williams, Denise said, her voice thick with emotion, I had no idea you owned the place. I mean, I knew you were important, but... Margaret smiled and pulled the young woman into a hug. Honey, I've been serving tables since before you were born. Owning something doesn't mean you're too good to do the work. She looked around at her staff, her chosen family. Every single person in this restaurant matters. Every job has dignity. That young man forgot that somewhere along the way. Carlos approached them, his usually quiet demeanor replaced by something that looked like awe. Mrs. Williams, my family in El Salvador, they're not going to believe this story. You stood up to that man like you weren't afraid of anything. Oh, I was afraid, Margaret admitted. I was terrified. When you build something from nothing, you're always afraid someone with more power might take it away. But fear and courage aren't opposites. Courage is what you do even when you're afraid. Over the next hour, word spread through the neighborhood with the speed that only good news can travel. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop next door came in with a bouquet of magnolias. The Martinez family from the corner market brought a bottle of champagne they'd been saving for a special occasion. Even Father O'Malley from St. Catherine's stopped by to shake Margaret's hand and tell her how proud the whole community was. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself thinking about Bradley Ashworth. She wondered if anyone had ever told him that respect was something you earned, not something you inherited. She wondered if his father had any idea what kind of man his son was becoming, or if he even cared. Most of all, she wondered if this experience might teach the young man something that all his money and privilege had failed to provide. The understanding that every person has value, regardless of their station in life. That evening, as Margaret locked up the restaurant, she found a note that had been slipped under the door. It was handwritten on expensive stationery. Mrs. Williams, I spoke with my father tonight about the Magnolia project. It's been cancelled indefinitely. I have a lot to learn about business, and about being a decent human being. Thank you for teaching me something important today. With sincere apologies, Bradley Ashworth III. Margaret folded the note carefully and slipped it into her purse. Tomorrow she would frame it and hang it next to that first review, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes, if you're very lucky, standing up for what's right can change more than just your own life. As she walked to her car under the warm glow of the streetlights her community association had fought to install, Margaret thought about her grandmother, who had always believed that love and dignity could overcome anything. You were right, Grandmama, she whispered to the evening breeze. You were absolutely right. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales of courage, community, and the power of treating every person with dignity. Thank you for joining Margaret's journey with us today.